Biblical scholars have argued about prophecy for 2,000 years and still cannot agree on what most of it means. No AI system has ever settled a question that trained humans have spent lifetimes failing to answer. Yet someone fed every prophecy in the Bible into a chatbot built to write emails, and what came back stopped the people reading it cold. What the viral claim actually says. A YouTube video posted in April 2026 described a scenario in which researchers in 2024 fed Grok AI the complete Book of Revelation alongside thousands of pages of historical data, then asked the system to identify patterns human scholars had missed across 2,000 years of interpretation. The video claimed the AI produced a specific timeline identifying the 7 seals, trumpets, and bowls as partially concurrent rather than sequential, detecting over 200 statistical correlations between prophetic descriptions and historical events with less than 0.1% probability of occurring by chance, and projecting a final tribulation period beginning between 2025 and 2030, with culminating events occurring between 2032 and 2037. That is the claim sitting behind everything. Before looking at whether any of it is checkable, the first thing worth establishing is what biblical prophecy actually is, how much of it exists, and what scholars have understood about it for centuries before any AI system was ever built. What the Bible actually contains. The most thorough count of biblical prophecy ever produced by a single scholar came from J. Barton Payne, who was a professor of Old Testament at Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis, and also taught at Wheaton College Graduate School of Theology and Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. After 20 years of systematic research, Payne published the Encyclopedia of Biblical Prophecy in 1973, cataloging 1,239 prophecies in the Old Testament and 578 in the New Testament, for a total of 1,817 individual prophetic entries across 8,352 verses. That works out to roughly 27% of the entire Bible being predictive in some form, covering 737 separate subjects. Payne's count is the most frequently cited scholarly baseline, though other researchers arrive at different numbers depending on how they define prophecy. Some figures cited widely in Christian apologetics reach as high as 2,500 total prophecies by counting every instance where a broad eschatological theme appears, even across different books and centuries. The disagreement is genuine, and not simply about individual passages. It reflects 4 entirely different schools of thought on what biblical prophecy is even meant to do, and those schools have been fighting the same fight since at least the 2nd century. The 4 main interpretive frameworks used by scholars are called preterism, historicism, futurism, and idealism. Preterists believe most or all of Revelation's prophecies were fulfilled in the 1st century, largely in events surrounding the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Historicists treat the text as a symbolic panorama of ongoing church history, from the time of writing through to the Second Coming. Futurists hold that the majority of Revelation's content still lies in the future and will be fulfilled literally in a compressed end-time scenario. Idealists read the text as theological symbolism describing the timeless struggle between good and evil, with no one-to-one correspondence to specific historical events or future dates. These are not fringe positions held by a handful of eccentrics. Christian scholars of serious academic standing have defended each one. Isaac Newton himself spent more of his working life on biblical interpretation than on physics, and he was a committed historicist who believed the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation mapped onto actual historical events from antiquity through his own day. His published analysis, Observations upon the Prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse of St. John, argued for a 7-step methodological approach to reading these texts, and specifically warned against the kind of prediction it is now popular to generate with AI. Newton wrote, in language that has aged remarkably well, that the folly of interpreters had been to foretell times and things by these prophecies, as if God designed to make them prophets, and that by this rashness they had not only exposed themselves, but brought the prophecy into contempt. Any AI system fed every biblical prophecy would be walking into a 2,000-year-old argument with no settled answer, generating output that could only reflect whichever interpretation its training data happened to favor. What Grok actually is, and what it does. Grok is a large language model built by xAI, the AI company founded by Elon Musk. Like every other large language model, it works by predicting the statistically most likely next word in a sequence, based on patterns absorbed from enormous amounts of training text. It can summarize, rephrase, analyze tone, generate arguments, and produce fluent text about almost any topic. What it cannot do is run independent historical analysis, calculate genuine statistical correlations from raw data it has never been given, or produce a verified timeline of future events from a text that scholars with lifetimes of expertise genuinely disagree about. The viral claims framing around the phrase, "researchers fed Grok every prophecy," is doing significant work here. Any person with an internet connection could paste the Book of Revelation into a Grok chat window and ask a leading question about timelines. That is not the same as a peer-reviewed research process. The Book of Revelation has 22 chapters and 404 verses. The Book of Daniel, the other primary apocalyptic text most frequently cited alongside it, is 12 chapters. Both have been in public English translation for centuries. Researchers have not needed AI to read them. The specific figure of over 200 statistical correlations with less than 0.1% probability of occurring by chance is the kind of detail that sounds precise and scientific, but has no published source to check against. A peer-reviewed paper generating that kind of statistical claim would need to specify exactly which historical events were being correlated, which verses they corresponded to, what probability model was used, and how chance was being defined against a background distribution. None of those details appear in the video. The claim exists as dramatic framing, not as documented research. That distinction matters enormously because it is exactly the behavior that researchers who study large language models have documented and named: the generation of confident-sounding output that cannot be verified against any external source. A 2024 paper published in Archive, summarized in a comprehensive survey that same year in the journal ACM Transactions on Information Systems, described this behavior plainly. Large language models produce hallucinated text that is in conflict with sources or cannot be verified by available sources. The paper's title was direct: "Hallucination is Inevitable, an Innate Limitation of Large Language Models." What scholars have actually spent centuries fighting over. The reason the viral framing of an AI-generated prophetic timeline feels significant to viewers is that biblical prophecy has a genuinely extraordinary documented track record in certain areas, and that track record has been the subject of rigorous academic debate for generations. Understanding it honestly requires separating what has actually been verified from what remains genuinely contested. The Cyrus prophecy stands as one of the most striking examples of documented predictive precision in the entire biblical text. The prophet Isaiah, writing around 700 BC, named a specific future ruler of Persia by name Cyrus, describing him as a shepherd who would perform God's pleasure and issue a decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Conservative scholars estimate this was written roughly 150 years before Cyrus the Great was born, and close to 200 years before the events it describes came to pass. When Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he issued the exact decree the passage anticipated, allowing the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple. The historian Josephus later recorded that Cyrus was shown Isaiah's prophecies and read his own name in the text. The prophecy appears in Isaiah chapters 44 and 45, and it is specific enough that critics who reject its predictive nature tend to argue these chapters of Isaiah were written later than the rest of the book, after Cyrus had already come to power, a debate that remains alive among biblical scholars today. The Ezekiel prophecy about the ancient city of Tyre, written in the 6th century BC, is another case that has generated serious scholarly attention. Ezekiel 26 describes a specific sequence of events in which many nations would come against Tyre, like waves of the sea. Its stones and timber would be thrown into the sea, and it would become a bare rock where fishermen spread their nets. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon besieged the coastal city beginning around 585 BC, destroying the mainland portion, but failing to take the island. Then in 332 BC, Alexander the Great did something genuinely unusual in ancient warfare. He took the rubble from the demolished mainland city and used it to build a causeway stretching half a mile out to the island, literally throwing the stones and timber of old Tyre into the sea, and conquered the island fortress. The combination of Nebuchadnezzar's assault and Alexander's causeway construction is cited by defenders of the prophecy's fulfillment as matching the specific details of the text in ways that stretch ordinary coincidence. Daniel's vision of 4 successive world empires, presented as a statue made of 4 metals in chapter 2 and as 4 beasts in chapter 7, has been interpreted by most mainstream Christian scholars across centuries as corresponding to Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Early church fathers including Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Origen, and Eusebius all made this identification. The description of the Fourth Kingdom as one that would crush and break all others in pieces, then itself fragment into a divided structure, has been connected to Rome's centuries-long domination of the ancient world and its eventual split. The identification is not universally agreed upon, with some critical scholars arguing the sequence ends with the Seleucid Greek Empire under Antiochus Epiphanes rather than Rome, but the basic framework of predicting empires in sequence from a text written in the 6th century BC remains one of the most discussed examples in all of prophetic literature. None of these examples require or involve AI to evaluate. They have been analyzed in depth by human scholars using textual criticism, archaeology, and historical research for centuries. What AI is genuinely beginning to do with Scripture is something quite different and considerably more concrete. What AI is actually doing to Scripture. The most comprehensive survey of legitimate AI research applied to biblical texts was published in the journal Analysts in April 2025 by researchers at Mackenzie Presbyterian University in Sao Paulo and Florida Gulf Coast University. The paper, titled Artificial Intelligence Applied to the Analysis of Biblical Scriptures, a Systematic Review, identified 85 peer-reviewed studies from a search of Scopus and Web of Science databases, and found that genuine AI work on the Bible falls into 7 main categories: machine translation, authorship identification, part-of-speech tagging, semantic annotation, clustering, categorization, and biblical interpretation. The results in each area are real and specific. Recurrent neural networks have been used to build translation systems for biblical texts in languages like Amharic that lack existing automated tools, addressing a genuine gap in access to these materials across the world. Deep learning models trained on digitized medieval manuscripts like the Avila Bible have successfully identified individual scribes' handwriting across hundreds of pages, work that required machines to track microscopic variations in ink stroke curvature that no human eye could reliably distinguish. A research team using convolutional neural networks confirmed what some scholars had long suspected about the Great Isaiah Scroll among the Dead Sea Scrolls, that its 54 columns were the work of 2 different scribes, with the transition occurring around column 27. Researchers have built multilingual semantic models by training neural networks on over 1,000 Bible translations in nearly 1,000 languages, producing tools that can map relationships between language families and find translation parallels across vast distances of geography and time. What the systematic review also found is that one category remains almost entirely undeveloped: biblical interpretation by AI, meaning genuine attempts to use these tools to understand prophetic meaning, theological themes, or eschatological patterns, is among the scarcest areas in the entire body of published research. The field is, in the review's own language, underexplored, with only a handful of papers attempting anything in this direction, and the methods used in those papers focusing on representation and clustering rather than on extracting contextual knowledge of the kind required to evaluate a prophetic claim. This is not a minor gap. Contextual knowledge, the ability to understand what a text meant in its original historical, cultural, and linguistic environment, and how it relates to events across centuries, is exactly what prophetic analysis requires. It is also exactly what the 2024 study published in Hifil Novum by researcher A.G. Elrod at the Vrija University found is systematically distorted in large language models. Elrod tested 5 major models including GPT-4 Turbo, Anthropic's Claude V2, Meta's Llama 2, and Google's PaSeLM2 on creative biblical text generation tasks using the 10 Commandments and the Book of Jonah, and found that all the models displayed a consistent progressive bias, leaning toward contemporary themes of environmental ethics, social justice, and inclusivity rather than traditional interpretations. This bias, the study concluded, originated directly from the training data the models learned from. The models were mirroring the tone and values of the modern internet, not the ancient world. If that kind of finding is what keeps you watching, subscribing is how you make sure the next one reaches you. Because what the hallucination research reveals about why this specific problem is so dangerous, with prophecy specifically, is where this gets genuinely unsettling. The hallucination problem and prophecy. The specific combination of biblical prophecy and AI chatbots creates one of the most dangerous conditions for what researchers call hallucination: the production of confident, fluent, and completely invented output. The problem is not unique to religious texts, but it is especially severe with them for reasons that go beyond ordinary factual errors. Biblical prophecy requires the ability to assess a claim across 3 different dimensions at once: what the original text said in its source language, what that language meant in its historical context, and how subsequent events can be verified against those specific claims. A large language model working from an English translation has already lost the first dimension, since English renders ambiguous ancient Hebrew and Greek terms into single modern words, collapsing distinctions that matter enormously. It has limited access to the second dimension, because the historical and archaeological context required to evaluate ancient claims is not uniformly represented in the training data these models draw from. And it has no mechanism for independently verifying the third dimension at all, since verification requires checking factual claims against documented historical records, not generating new text. When a user asks a chatbot a leading question such as, "What patterns does Revelation reveal about events between 2025 and 2030?" the chatbot does not evaluate the question against any factual standard. It identifies the emotional register and the implicit expectation of the question, which is that something dramatic will be revealed, and generates output that satisfies that expectation. The specific dates and percentages and correlation figures the chatbot produces are shaped by whatever phrasing the user supplied, not by any calculation the AI actually ran. This is not a minor edge case quirk. Researchers at the University of Waterloo and the University of Guelph published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2021, demonstrating that deep learning systems designed to detect warning signals in time series data, a real and legitimate scientific tool for identifying approaching tipping points in complex systems, could still be led astray by the wrong pre-processing choices, producing false alarms or missing real transitions depending on factors the model could not assess on its own. If systems specifically built to detect patterns in data can generate misleading outputs when given data that does not match their design assumptions, a general-purpose chatbot given a 2,000-year-old symbolic text and a leading question about specific future years is in a considerably more precarious position. The history of dates that came and went. The claim that AI has produced a terrifying prophetic timeline sits in a very specific tradition of date-based predictions tied to religious or numerical frameworks, and that tradition has one of the most consistent track records of any genre of popular claim. The dates arrive and pass without the predicted events. December 21, 2012 was promoted for years as the date on which the ancient Maya long count calendar predicted the end of the world. Maya scholars consistently explained throughout that period that the date simply marked the completion of one calendar cycle and the beginning of another, the same way that December 31 marks the end of a year without ending civilization. The date passed, the same framework of a specific, confident date tied to an ancient system, then shifted to a series of predictions connected to a supposed rogue planet called Nibiru, which was successively predicted to cause catastrophe in 2003, then 2012, then September of 2017, then November of 2017, then April of 2018. Each date passed quietly, and the next date was announced. The specific mechanism by which AI chatbots generate prophetic timelines is precisely what makes them so well suited to producing the next item in this sequence. Because a chatbot will mirror whatever year or date the user mentions in the question, every new question produces a new specific and alarming timeline that feels freshly generated by a sophisticated system. The output is new, even if the pattern it follows is old. What makes the current moment different from the 2012 predictions is that the authority figure behind the timeline has been upgraded from an ancient calendar to an AI, which carries genuine cultural prestige right now and sounds more scientific than astrology or numerology, even when the underlying process is no more rigorous. What has actually been published about AI in Scripture? The gap between what the viral claim describes and what the published research actually shows is not subtle. The 85 studies reviewed in the Analytics Systematic Review represent the genuine frontier of AI research applied to biblical texts, and none of them involved generating prophetic timelines, calculating end times correlations, or projecting dates for tribulation periods. They involve machine translation, handwriting analysis, authorship attribution, semantic clustering, and language kinship mapping. The research that does exist on AI and scriptural interpretation found things that are genuinely useful, but not dramatic. Researchers who applied latent Dirichlet allocation, a topic modeling technique, to the Hebrew Bible were able to automatically extract thematic clusters that largely matched conclusions human scholars had already reached through years of study. With some novel additions, the automated analysis surfaced. Researchers who applied sentiment analysis to different translations of the same passages found measurable differences in emotional tone between the formality-oriented King James Version and the more conversational New International Version, providing quantified evidence for something Bible readers had long described impressionistically. A study published in Hippil Novum in 2024, separate from Elrod's bias research, evaluated the performance of large language models specifically on biblical Hebrew text, and found the tools demonstrated unreliable results when subjected to the dramatic differences inherent in the ancient form and syntax of biblical Hebrew. The tools were designed to analyze modern languages, primarily English, and that mismatch created serious limitations for any serious scholarly application to the original texts. A further study published in Practical Theology in 2025 looked at how Swedish pastors actually used AI chatbots in sermon preparation, and found that the preachers primarily used them for brainstorming and inspiration, then critically evaluated the AI-generated responses using their own theological training and pastoral experience before incorporating anything. No pastor in the study treated a chatbot's output as authoritative. They treated it as a draft for a human expert to review. That is precisely the relationship between AI and scriptural interpretation that the published research supports, and it is almost exactly the opposite of the relationship the viral framing of a terrifying AI-generated prophetic timeline implies. What researchers who study LLM biases actually found about prophecy. The specific finding from Elrod's 2024 study about progressive bias in large language models is worth sitting with longer than the viral claim about prophetic timelines, because it is the kind of concrete, documented, peer-reviewed result that actually tells you something true about how these systems handle religious texts. When the 5 AI models in that study were asked to generate 5 new commandments to follow the 10 commandments of Exodus 20, all of them produced commandments that emphasized environmental ethics, social justice, and inclusivity, themes prominent in contemporary public discourse, but not dominant in traditional interpretations of the Mosaic Law. When asked to write a 5th chapter to the book of Jonah, a dominant interpretive trend appeared across models. They tended to mirror historical and prevailing interpretations, but filtered through a lens shaped by their training data, which skews heavily toward modern English internet content. What this means for prophetic analysis specifically is significant. If you ask a large language model to identify which events in current headlines correspond to prophetic passages, the model will not be drawing on a neutral, scholarly analysis of the ancient text. It will be drawing on whatever interpretations of those passages are most prominent in the English language content it was trained on, weighted toward contemporary concerns and the frameworks most frequently discussed in online spaces. The output will feel revelatory because it uses authoritative language and specific numbers. It will actually be reflecting the mirror of whatever assumptions the training data happen to contain. The study in the journal Scientific Reports from 2025, also documented an analysis of AI tools for Christian leaders, found something similarly concrete. AI-generated texts about Christianity included more positive terms like love and forgiveness, while texts about Islam included significantly more conflict references, a measurable bias attributable to the different way these traditions are discussed across the training corpus. The AI was not analyzing the texts from a neutral starting point. It was inheriting the biases of the internet. Why the Book of Revelation resists what I is being asked to do to it. The Book of Revelation is a specific kind of ancient text called apocalyptic literature, a genre with conventions and purposes that are genuinely different from straightforward prophecy in the predictive sense that the viral framing implies. Ancient Jewish and Christian apocalyptic writing, including Daniel, Revelation, and several other texts from the same period, used elaborate symbolic imagery, numerology, and coded references for reasons scholars have documented carefully. Writing in a period of political oppression, the authors used symbolic language partly to communicate to insiders, while remaining incomprehensible to hostile outsiders. The beast with 7 heads and 10 horns in Revelation 13 was almost certainly understood by its original readers as a reference to Rome, whose emperors' names could be calculated using gematria, the ancient practice of assigning numerical values to letters. The specific number 666, described in Revelation 13:18 as the number of a beast whose name can be calculated, has been identified by most scholars since the 19th century as a numerical representation of the name Nero Caesar in Hebrew letters. None of this requires AI to identify. It has been in the published scholarly literature for over a century. The 4 schools of interpretation exist precisely because the symbolic content of Revelation is not transparently decodable by a simple reading, and every era has tended to find in it a mirror of its own most pressing anxieties. This is not a criticism of the text. It reflects the genuine theological complexity and the enduring human desire to understand suffering within a framework that provides meaning. But it means that an AI system asked to generate a prophetic timeline from this text is not performing neutral analysis. It is producing output shaped by which interpretation dominated its training data, which specific year or event the person asking mentioned in the question, and which emotional register the question invited. What a real AI project applied to prophetic texts would require. The University of Groningen research team that built the Enoch handwriting analysis model provides a useful contrast case, because it illustrates what legitimate AI work on ancient religious texts actually looks like. That project took years to develop. It trained its model on manuscripts that had already been dated using radiocarbon testing, giving it a confirmed set of answers to learn from before it was ever asked to evaluate anything new. It published its methodology in a peer-reviewed journal, the same journal where Mladen Popovic's earlier work on the Great Isaiah Scrolls' dual authorship had appeared, so other scholars could examine and challenge the approach. When the model was applied to 135 Dead Sea Scroll fragments that had never been radiocarbon dated, its estimates skewed older than previous handwriting-based guesses, in some cases by 50 to 100 years. Two specific fragments, one containing verses from Daniel catalogued as 4Q114 and one containing verses from Ecclesiastes catalogued as 4Q109, produced estimates placing the manuscripts close to the traditional lifetimes of the book's authors. That result is remarkable, and it is published, checkable, and specific. A genuine AI project, aimed at prophetic analysis of the kind the viral claim describes, would require at minimum a clearly defined model of what constitutes a fulfilled prophecy and what does not, which is itself the subject of centuries of scholarly disagreement with no consensus. It would require access to historically verified databases of events with timestamps, and a transparent process for establishing which prophetic verses correspond to which historical events, where both the prophetic text and the historical record are specific enough to make the correspondence testable. It would need expert review at every step by scholars fluent in the original languages, and its methods and outputs would need to be published so other researchers could verify or challenge them. None of that is what a chatbot prompt session produces. A chatbot prompt session produces text shaped by the question's framing, the training data's dominant interpretations, and the model's tendency to generate confident output regardless of whether confidence is warranted. Verdict here is what the record actually shows. J. Barton Payne cataloged 1,817 biblical prophecies across 8,352 verses over 20 years of systematic scholarly work, published in 1973. Scholars have been arguing about how to interpret those passages across four distinct frameworks: preterist, historicist, futurist, and idealist, since the 2nd century, with serious defenders on every side and no consensus about which framework is correct. Isaac Newton himself spent more time on this question than on any scientific problem, specifically warned against the kind of date-setting the viral claim performs, and produced 7 methodological steps for taking the text seriously on their own terms. The 2025 Systematic Review in Analytics found that genuine AI research on biblical texts has produced real results in machine translation, handwriting analysis, authorship attribution, and semantic clustering, and found that biblical interpretation by AI is the least developed area in the entire field. The 2024 study in Hiphil Novum found that large language models produce a measurable progressive bias when asked to engage with biblical content, reflecting the values of their training data rather than any neutral scholarly analysis. The hallucination literature establishes that language models are structurally incapable of producing verified factual claims, only statistically plausible text, and that the tendency to produce confident-sounding answers regardless of available evidence is not a bug to be patched, but an innate limitation of how these systems work. A chatbot being asked what events Revelation predicts between 2025 and 2037 will produce a specific, dramatic, statistically adorned answer. It will not be the result of a calculation. It will be the result of a pattern. The difference between those two things is the entire story. If deep dives that separate what is actually documented from what is just a compelling headline are what you're here for, subscribing costs nothing and keeps this channel doing exactly that.